just going to go over a few things that are specific to Cambridge in terms of the teaching style and some of the sort of things that we offer in undergraduate and undergraduate courses. And I want to link that quite heavily to the second thing, which is this idea of engaging with supercurricular content. And hopefully, if it hasn't already occurred to you, it will sort of become quite clear why the first part of this is quite important for engaging with supercurricular content, some of the stuff that you're asked to do, early on in year 12 or at this point in year 12. And then the thing I want to talk about at the end, if there's time, I want to go into a fair bit more detail just about some of the more advanced things that you can be doing beyond the standard stuff that you're often told is a good idea for supercurricular engagement. Some of the things that, while you wouldn't have to do loads of, definitely isn't beyond the reach of an A-level student, and is definitely something it could be useful to think of as working up to. So that's sort of the outline. For people who were in the talk that I did the other week, I will repeat some of the content, especially in sort of the middle of this talk, but I'll try and sort of be more concise about some of those elements. So firstly, and this is just sort of for when I distribute the PowerPoint, so you have a sort of map in your head of the application process. I always think it's useful to share this at this sort of time of the year. People would have seen this before if they attended the previous talk. It's just an outline of the application process, detailing some of the important points, and hopefully just, I mean, basically everything you do, with the exception of explicitly mentioning the personal statement in this section here, which says apply for UCAS. Basically everything you'll have to do within a Cambridge application is listed here. And the reason I think it's useful to show it is, first, just it's good to have this picture early on in your mind before getting into year 13. And also, I kind of want to emphasize that in order to do well at a Cambridge application, the stuff that you should be doing at the moment doesn't really touch on a lot of this stuff. It doesn't really, you don't need to be thinking about interviews now, or pre-assessments, or any of the more sort of fine-grained stuff like, what written work you might submit if you're an arts and humanities student. The main thing is what I'll be talking about in a bit, this idea of engaging with supercurricular content. And that is really the key thing that is, I suppose it's a good idea to take away from this session, is that that's the stuff that you should be doing at the moment. And that will help with things like choosing a course, with doing well in A-levels, with writing a competitive application. So the first section is just this, a little bit of information on how teaching works at Cambridge. And you might be familiar with some of this already, or you might not. But some of the standard features that you'll get at any university are lectures, seminars, labs, and then a sort of focus on independent study. I mean, the thing that might seem that might seem novel is seminars, and if that's an unfamiliar term, that's essentially just you're sitting in a room with maybe 12 people or so, and there'll be an academic leading the session, but they'll be leading it as opposed to lecturing you, and they will be sort of, you might be discussing a piece of work or literature, or a problem in mathematics, for instance, as a group. So it's sort of like a class-based discussion learning that is far less sort of being talked at, whereas lectures are sort of, you're just listening, throughout the whole thing to the person. It's far less interactive most of the time. One of the main things that sets Cambridge apart, and also Oxford, from other universities, is that we have this focus on supervisions as the way in which people learn. Supervisions are effectively one-to-one meetings with academics. You have one at least every week. You'll probably do a piece of work, either a problem sheet if you're doing something like maths, or an essay for things like arts and humanities or medicine. You'll do an essay for the supervision, and within that, you might be set, for instance, if it's arts and humanities, you might be set 5 pieces of literature or chapters or something to look at, and you'll construct an essay based on that content. You'll then sit down with the academic for about an hour or so, sometimes more, and they will sort of go through what you've done well in that essay. They'll discuss the themes with you in sort of quite an intellectual way. You'll essentially be having an academic conversation with this person who will be giving you a lot of really critical specific feedback on the thing that you've written. And this is the main way in which people make progress somewhere like Cambridge. It's sort of what constitutes the bulk of the learning process, really. And because we have these supervisions and not just lectures, we have a lot more of an emphasis as well on independent study. And hopefully it should be clear why that is. It's because when you're literally doing large pieces of work for a supervision, that you're sort of just on your own until you actually meet up with the supervisor to go through it. So there's a lot there's really a need when you go somewhere like Cambridge or Oxford to be quite good at this independent learning already, to have got some of this in the bag. And the other reason that this is really important is that we have 8-week terms. The terms normally at universities are around 12 weeks or so. Cambridge terms are a lot shorter, and within those 8 weeks you will be doing a supervision at least once every week. So that's a lot of very focused, directed, independent study that you'll be engaging with. So candidates who can demonstrate some aptitude within, a capacity for independent study when they come to apply, are going to be candidates that we look very favorably upon. I've included a bit more information, just sort of bullet pointed, about supervisions, just for you to glance over in your spare time, I suppose. But the main thing that it's important sort of to emphasize is that supervisions are one of the most, I suppose, expensive, for us, not for you, but are the most valuable pieces of learning resource, I suppose, somewhere like Cambridge. And that means we want to see candidates who are going to benefit from this kind of from this system. Interviews are another way in which we can get a bit more of a clear picture of as to whether or not a candidate's going to do well with this supervision style method of teaching. But at the moment, the thing to think about is how you can show that you're a candidate who is a good independent learner, but by engaging with supercurricular content. And there's a little bit more information here as well about supervisions. Yeah, just to emphasize that this is how people really academically progress somewhere like Cambridge. I don't know if I mentioned this last time, but one of the nice things about this kind of system of doing a supervision every week, for instance, and sticking with the arts and humanities example, you will end up writing essentially somebody's PhD thesis by there's just the sheer quantity of work that you end up submitting to supervisors over the course of 3 years. You effectively end up writing a thesis. If you were really happy with all your essays, or you rewrote all your essays, for instance, into one big thing, it would be like writing a thesis at graduate level. And that's a really great thing about Cambridge, is the sheer number of topics you cover, the sheer amount of work that you end up doing. If that sounds daunting, I can sort of guarantee you that after sort of getting into the swing of things, after sort of understanding how to do this workload, after a few weeks, it will become a lot easier. But yeah, the other thing I thought I might highlight, which is less related to this point about supercurricular content, but might just be worth mentioning, is one of the so yeah, like I said, there's this focus on independent study somewhere like Cambridge, but in addition to it being very focused and very driven, because it's aimed at getting out supervision work within the course of a week, which is quite nice. There are also a load of resources that we offer undergraduates that are slightly different from other universities in some ways. The one to highlight here is that we have this 3-part library system, for instance. So you'll have a college library, which is essentially where you'll do quite a lot of studying. It will be where you live as well. The colleges are essentially autonomous collectives of students and academics, where students are sort of housed, and there are quite a lot of those around Cambridge. And that's quite nice. It's quite nice to have a college library. It's somewhere that's where you're based, that you just have access to study in. A lot of libraries, college libraries, are 24/7. The other nice thing is that people from other colleges can't go into other college libraries. So if you went to King's College, for instance, you wouldn't be able to go into the Corpus Christi library. That would just be for Corpus Christi students. So it's nice to have that sort of designated workspace with just people that you live with, essentially. There are also faculty libraries, which are really great. Faculties are the other sort of aspect of, I suppose, Cambridge infrastructure that's useful to know about. And those are sort of just dedicated to individual subjects. So there's a philosophy faculty, there's a history faculty, a maths faculty. And they have really, really specialized libraries. Typically, those are incredibly good for doing things like dissertations, finding very niche things perhaps that a supervisor has recommended for an essay. And we also have the university library, which has basically every book or academic book ever written. And that's slightly, I mean, you can get any book that you want from that, but it's quite interesting to utilize in different ways. You can find lots of stuff that you would never have thought of looking for, even in a faculty library, from somewhere like that. And we've also got loads of ebooks and e-journals that you get subscriptions to. So that's sort of probably all there is to say on this. The other thing about sort of Cambridge learning and study that's possibly worth mentioning is this idea of the academic community. There are a lot of talks and lectures that are sort of on offer throughout the academic year. Those might be, those might be events that are related to your subject faculty. So those might be, if you're doing history, those might just be history talks put on by the history faculty. But equally, you can go to other talks and other faculties have put on that you find interesting. And often there are a lot of sort of inter-subject things that are put on either by external bodies or sort of just interdisciplinary collaboration, which end up being incredibly interesting. Yeah, and things like discussion groups as well are really one of the sort of central things that that sort of make up the Cambridge community. Undergraduates can start discussion groups. Often there are really interesting ones put on by academic staff that invite all sorts of interesting external speakers as well. So there's a lot to the academic community at Cambridge beyond sort of just use of the libraries and use of the faculty libraries and things like that, that also sort of aid academic development. And the reason I sort of just wanted to go over these things, and I think I've possibly covered this a little vaguely, but is first to emphasize why supervisions connect up to what you're doing now. So this prospect of wanting to be taught via this, this sort of one-to-one, with this sort of one-to-one style teaching, why this links up to supercurricular activities. You want to be engaging with content at the moment that marks you out as an independent learner, and someone who would do well making use of these supervisions. I mentioned sort of using libraries and resources and stuff as well, is because that's another aspect of the general sort of higher education experience that it's good to demonstrate some, I suppose, familiarity with, in a sense, utilizing resources in an intelligent way. You're using different using different libraries, spending a bit of time deciding what you're going to actually be looking at, rather than sort of just jumping straight into a particular text or maths problem. That's something I'm hoping to move on to at the end. And I mentioned the academic community as well, because one thing that I think is a really good idea for students to start doing now is to start thinking about, I suppose, collaborating with other A-level students, even if it's just one or two people, other people, either looking at interesting maths problems beyond the curriculum, looking at interesting chapters of primary text, for instance, and discussing those. That's another really useful thing to start getting acquainted with now, even before you get into things like year 13. So hopefully that sort of makes sense.
Yeah, Will, could I just very briefly interrupt there? Because I mean, before you said that, actually, I was going to say that that's something we'd really want to develop, and I think students would really benefit from. So the students within this group, as we get to know each other, you'll get to know the students, hopefully, that are interested in the same subject. So we would really like to get these sort of discussion groups going, even if it's just a bunch of you communicating on, I don't know, what do you use, WhatsApp or Snapchat or whatever, just to kind of talking about your subject. So I definitely think this is something that we'll look into sort of doing, and we might be asking for volunteers to kind of be the lead person in particular subject areas. But would you be interested in starting something like that with a bunch of I think it would really help kind of just, yes, good, okay, brilliant. So what I can do is go back through your original application forms and kind of get an idea of what subjects people are interested in, and then maybe try and group you in subject areas. So yeah, I think that's unanimous. But luckily, no one said no. Okay, all right, thank you.
Yeah, this is one of the most important things, really, actually, that that I normally save until sort of interview times. That in interview presentations, when I talk about what candidates can do to do well at interview. But to be honest, engaging with supercurricular content by discussion group really make sure that you practice some of the key skills that we actually look for. And one thing I'll talk about in a second, for instance, is this idea of actually not trying to read everything, but trying to sort of really critically engage with a few things. And a discussion group lets you do that, because you can't just talk about, you can't just talk really, really generally about everything. You can't, even if you've read loads and loads, you've skimmed lots and lots of stuff. It just encourages you to look at particular chapters or even paragraphs in a lot more detail. So hopefully that makes sense. I think I probably could take some questions of what I've just been talking about. If anyone wants me to, any questions really that anyone has at this point. I don't know if there are any in the chat.
Not yet, but sometimes they take a while to come through.
That's okay. Well, I'll continue and then I'll stop if any have.
I'll put my hand. Can you see if I put my hand up?
I can't. No.
No. Oh, okay. Well, that's pointless then. Okay. I'll just interrupt if there's questions.
Yeah, just interrupt. It's fine. So yeah, the thing I'll quickly talk about is this idea of choosing a course. I spoke about this last time for anyone who was in that the session a couple of weeks ago. But one of the main reasons, beyond showing that you're good at independent learning and stuff like that, that you want to engage in supercurricular stuff now, is so you can literally choose a course. There are a lot of different courses at different universities, even for things that sort of sound similar. So, politics, for instance, the example I've got here, you would probably be in for a nasty surprise if you just applied to politics courses at different universities without actually looking at what they involved, what they ended up actually teaching. It's really important to essentially do two things at this stage, at this point in the year. The first is simply to start looking up courses on different university websites, actually reading what they contain. You might look at reading lists, for instance, that you can get access to on undergraduate websites. And the other thing is that you need to be engaging with content that is mentioned in these courses. So it's not enough really to just think loosely, I'm interested in politics, I guess I'll read some stuff about politics. You need to be looking at what's on offer at different universities, and then you need to be looking at those things and thinking, how can I research these ideas that are on offer on these courses? Because that ensures that you're linking up your independent study with the courses that you might end up applying to. I said this last time, you don't have to have an idea of what you want to study yet, as in you don't have to have a really specific idea in mind or any idea. But it does make sense for you to look up this content and then to start, if you've got a few different things that you want to engage with, you're thinking about doing, it's important to look at content in those different subjects or those different degrees, so that you can start getting an idea of whether you'd find that interesting or not. And you might not think that that's you might think that you can come to some kind of conclusion without doing that, but obviously that just because of how the approaches differ even within a particular subject, to a subject, there is a sort of lot of know-how that you gain from actually looking at a maths puzzle or engaging with a text in a certain way, or thinking about something in a certain way. I mean, take history, for instance. If you're looking at a primary text in history, for instance, something from the past that you're sort of reading against the grain, you're finding very interesting, you should ask yourself questions about that. You should ask yourself, what am I actually finding interesting here? Am I finding the history interesting, the stuff that would normally be judged as being central to a history degree, or is it politics? So my subject, for instance, is philosophy, and I know that if I read a history text, what I find really interesting is more theoretical stuff about it, more sort of general conceptual questions. So I'd probably make a really bad historian in that sense, in terms of the sheer generality of what I'd be interested in, and the sort of tangents that I'd want to go off at from a particular text. So just because you're enjoying reading something or looking at something, it doesn't necessarily mean that that you're interested in history just because you're looking at a history primary text. So hopefully that makes sense why you'd want to actually engage in different things, in different subjects in this kind of way. And yeah, so the other central reason that I sort of touched on in all the stuff about Cambridge I was talking about a second ago, and the other central reason you need to engage in supercurricular content now is the personal statement. That's something that you'll probably end up starting to think about in a few months, maybe just in summer. I'm not sure when you're planning, as a school to start looking at this. The main thing now is just to engage in the stuff you're going to be talking about, but obviously writing the personal statement will be a lot easier if you've done all of if you've done all the supercurricular engagement beforehand. Personal statements, for anyone who wasn't in the last one, and if it isn't clear, they're essentially just letters to your university that are read by people like your interviewers or admissions tutors, the people deciding on whether you're going to get in. They're pretty short. They're about a side of A4. And most of what you're talking about, as I put here, about at least 80% really, needs to be based on supercurricular activities. And I realize I'm not entirely sure if I've defined it for anyone who wasn't in the last one, but supercurricular activities are essentially stuff that goes beyond the curriculum, over and above supercurricular. Stuff that goes over and above the curriculum that you're doing in A-level. That it might be new content, it might be a more challenging way to look at certain content, it might just sort of be a natural progression from one topic to another. It's stuff that isn't included in A-level in one way or another that shows that you're a good independent learner. So I mean, a good example is something like an EPQ. It sort of sits on the boundary of being supercurricular and also on your curriculum. As an EPQ, you get quite a lot of teacher assistance, for instance, and it's sort of almost part of your studies. Whereas supercurricular, it's a bit more on the independent side than that. So it's you on your own deciding that you want to look into a certain topic, and it's then and then actually investigating that, having some interesting thoughts about it, and approaching the topic in an intelligent way so that you're actually going to get a lot out of what you're doing. And hopefully this emphasizes the idea that it's not just about reading lots and lots of content. For those of you who were in the last session, it's not just about reading loads of stuff. It's about showing us that when you set yourself a kind of topic of interest that you want to look at, you can engage with that in a way that you actually you get stuff from it and you can talk about it intelligently, for instance. Just showcasing some of those independent study skills, I suppose. And a lot counts as supercurricular. There's a lot of stuff that it's that we are interested to hear about in things like your personal statement, and just stuff that really helps you academically progress. So I've listed a few here. You can see the reading groups, for instance, I've mentioned as well. It's not just about doing further reading or practicing maths. It's about engaging with content in numerous ways. There are some other suggestions here. Again, all of this, people who weren't in the last session, I'll distribute this PowerPoint, and there's some other stuff, hopefully that people who were in the session haven't had a chance to look at either. This is just this point, again, of not reading every single thing or not engaging with every single thing you can think of. At undergraduate level, you will be engaging with things in a very niche and specific way. You're not going, an undergraduate isn't trying to learn literally everything. It is engaging with particular modules in quite a measured and quite a critical way. So if you start getting that, if you start practicing independent study in that way now, it's going to help you a lot. The example here is somebody wanting to read, a really mammoth book, for instance. A lot of people do that. This is, this comment is based on the fact that so many people will submit personal statements having said stuff like, "Oh, I've read all of Marx" and stuff, and we're frankly not really very impressed by that, because typically the candidate hasn't read all of Marx. They've either skimmed it or they've sort of convinced themselves into thinking that they've read the majority of it. We are far more impressed when candidates read particular things, when they've arrived at those things from actually thinking about the topic, thinking about what interests them. They might have even spent a week or two literally just sort of, when they're doing this kind of further stuff, literally just thinking about what they might want to end up reading or looking at. They might be Googling things online, they might be browsing interesting archives and stuff, they might be reading very introductory material about stuff. And then they might arrive at a particular chapter, for example, in this case of Marx, and then really analyzing that and honing in on that. Reading the text more than once often helps, even though often people don't seem to do that. And then reading secondary literature and stuff based on this, based on what they've actually been looking at, and maybe stuff that links it to other interesting topics. That's the kind of engagement that we want to see. And obviously not every single thing you engage with has to be a mini dissertation, as it were. You can get a lot of nice sort of broad understanding of things from literally listening to a podcast every now and again. So, I wouldn't discourage you from sort of engaging with the kind of, I suppose, bitty, less structured approach to this kind of supercurricular engagement. But just note that this is a really good way to engage with content that if you do even a few times in this level of detail, it will pay off a lot in numerous respects. Just to flag this for anyone who wasn't in the last session, if you're doing a STEM subject and it's really mathematically orientated, even if you're doing something like economics, and if you've taken my advice on the previous slides and you've researched the courses, you'll know if it applies to you. Please do not submit a personal statement that just says you've read lots of popular books, because we want to see that you've engaged with the actual mathematics related to that degree, because we want to see if you're good at the independent study that relates to that degree, right? So just in the same way that I said, when you're looking up a course, make sure that you're actually not just looking up, supercurricular stuff in politics, but you're looking up supercurricular stuff in politics that relates to the courses that you're actually interested in studying. In that way, make sure that your actual method of engagement suits the course too. So you're not going to be reading lots of sort of books designed for lay consumption in a physics degree. You're going to be doing a lot of maths. So make sure that you are doing maths beyond your A-level curriculum, and in order to demonstrate that level of independent study. And I again emphasize that don't see that as me saying that you can't read interesting non-fiction books, but the main thing we're going to be looking for in a subject like physics, for instance, is engagement in physics. Yeah, so hopefully that makes sense. I spoke about this a bit last time. I think I'll move briefly through this. There's just some suggestions for engaging with supercurricular content by linking it to an A level. So I've sort of suggested that it's really useful for you to engage with content that's related to a particular course at undergraduate level. And that's definitely true. But you can also do well, and obviously it's good if they completely intersect. You can also do well with using A levels as a basis from which to explore topics further, because you're already familiar with the A level topics you're studying, and hopefully it will relate to your A level topics quite explicitly in a way that helps A levels, and also just, I suppose, lets you make progress more quickly with a topic than if you were learning a topic from scratch, for instance. So that's one suggestion. And then you probably will have seen these last time, just these sort of visual graphics for this idea of, somebody looking at a book in English, and then some suggestions for how they can go into this content further. The same with something like biology, a few other suggestions as well. The important thing to note here actually is that I've sort of divided these two like you'd just be, like you'd be building on books for arts and humanities, and then like you'd be building on a topic for science. And obviously that's not true. You can easily, take a topic even from something like English to study further rather than just a book. You can take interesting topics in grammar, for instance, that you might think are worthy of some further study, especially in things like poetry, for instance. So that's just worth bearing in mind. Okay, good. Now, the thing that I just actually, any questions now? Because this is another natural stopping point. Either any that have come through before or ones that people want to ask now.
Let me just check. Nothing yet. Carry on.
Yeah. So I just want to get a bit more specific now about how you might go about engaging with some of this supercurricular material. Some of the first, just some of the suggestions that is useful to engage with a lot of the time, and then some further suggestions that might be slightly more advanced. So here's a list of stuff that is just useful to engage with on a regular basis. This isn't exhaustive in any sense, but it can be quite useful. So if you're the two first examples are pretty straightforward. It's just Google and Wikipedia. It's an obvious starting point if you want to find out about a particular topic, but make sure that you actually use it, because typically if you see something on a course website, on a reading list, for instance, and it says, oh, that here's an interesting topic that you haven't heard of before, and you're thinking, how do I engage with that? Typing in the topic to Google with some sort of qualifications like academic or archive or something like that often yield pretty decent results. So make sure that you do that. Likewise with texts, if you can't find a particular piece of literature or a particular textbook that you want to look at, sometimes literally just typing in the name of the text and then PDF or something will give you the result that you need. That is obvious, but I think sometimes people forget that they can do that to find stuff. Wikipedia is another one. The references are often freely accessible because Wikipedia authors don't often have or don't have to have university credentials, so they don't necessarily have access to some of the the libraries and the e-journals and things. So you can find nice open access material in the references to Wikipedia, and obviously for some subjects it is just useful to read through. I think there's no point being snobby about Wikipedia. It is a good resource, even if it's not always 100% accurate, and especially if you're new to a topic, it's good for getting a general overview. Likewise with things like watching videos on YouTube, listening to podcasts and things like that. I've mentioned university resources already. I highlight archives as well. In addition to sort of looking at reading lists and stuff from undergrad, that undergraduates would look at, and just finding topics to engage with from those. Looking at university archives or library archives, for instance, that are parts of universities is often quite useful, because there'll be a lot of free content on those. A lot of different libraries have, at Cambridge, for instance, have archives that people can access without university logins, which is good. And then there are a few online archives here which I think are quite useful. One of the best ones is the Open Library, and you can find a lot of incredibly good information, or books even, sorry, on the Open Library that are just not available elsewhere. I'd really recommend using this. You have to make a login, and then you can borrow the book, and then it sort of gets returned to the ether, as it were. But you can just keep on re-borrowing it, and you can also screenshot, because it's not that, I don't think it's that sophisticated, so you can screenshot relevant chapters that you want to look at. And of course, if you follow my advice about engaging with specific things rather than trying to read whole books, if you find an interesting academic book on something like the Open Library, really, you do only need to be reading a chapter or so, and really engaging with that. I mean, obviously, sometimes you might want to read a whole thing, a whole book or something, because you find it interesting, but often it makes more sense to practice that more focused and critical engagement. But that's a really great resource for sciences, for arts and humanities. I found a lot of great resources just, personally on those. For instance, I found really interesting stuff in philosophy that's pretty niche. I found interesting poetry criticism and stuff. There's loads of great stuff. I'd recommend free articles on magazine websites as well. Academic magazines, journals, for instance, as well. Online courses is another one. I've just mentioned 2 good online course websites here. Following or liking academic journals and societies is another great option. You get a constant feed of information from people who have a lot of knowledge in the subject you're interested in. That will sometimes be links to things that I've been talking about, like podcasts and journals, and then you don't have to do all the digging yourself. You're getting a nice feed of that, of supercurricular stuff to engage with. I've mentioned the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as well, because I think it is just a useful thing for people to engage with, no matter what subject they're looking at. If you're doing physics, for example, and you want a bit of a break from just doing the maths, by all means, take a look at something interesting there, like the philosophy of quantum mechanics or something, because that stuff is really interesting. And presumably, if you're interested in physics, you're interested in that more conceptual stuff as well, a lot of the time anyway. And the other 2 I've mentioned are Isaac Physics and Isaac Chemistry. You might use those for homework, but 2 very good websites for engaging with mathematical content beyond the A-level curriculum, and also in the A-level curriculum as well. And then I just want to move on to some things that are slightly more in depth, that, like I said at the beginning, it sort of makes sense to think about engaging with now, even if you're not doing a great deal of it. These are some databases, some archives, essentially, that are all open access, so all the stuff is free, and essentially just for a lot of different subjects. I've put the ones in bold that I think are the best ones, or the most reliable ones. And a lot of these are pretty heavy academic papers that, if you read one of, you would be doing very well, and it would look very good on an application. These 2 are for the sciences. That includes physics and stuff, but then this is just things like biochemistry, but also stuff like animal cognition and things like that. This list here is probably the best one, especially if you're arts and humanities. That just has a sort of alphabetical list of different subjects and a few suggestions for online journals, academic journals in each subject. And I've taken 3 examples from this list just to give you an idea of the variety of things that you could look at on a website like that. This one is called the Programming Historian. This is literally this really weird website that's sort of a cross between an academic journal and a blog, designed for historians who want to do, who are doing certain projects where it makes sense to have certain technical skills. And this is actually something that can come in very useful for A-level research projects and stuff. This is in no sense beyond anything you're doing. So this is the example that I chose from this is the pretty bland title, Extracting Illustrated Pages from Digital Libraries of Python, and then the supplementary article that explains some of the things that you might need to know about to understand this one. So in total, you'd read 2 pretty short articles, and then you'd have a decent skill that you can practice, that you can mention on an academic CV, and also you can actually use to do interesting projects with. So this lets you extract all of the illustrated pages from a big PDF, like 1,000, 2,000 pages. You might have got that for free on an online archive, for instance, from the British Library or something like that. And this lets you extract all the illustrated pages, and then essentially do whatever it is you're wanting to do with those. If I use I can't remember if I used these in the last session, but if I did, I think I gave the example of looking at scientific atlases, for example. This would be an instance where using this would be great if you want to look at how different ideas of archetypes and atlases and things like that have progressed throughout history. Then you'll probably be wanting to look at the pictures mostly from some of the books you're looking at. Being able to extract all of those using information from a website like this is pretty useful. It would be incredibly time consuming to try to do that without a tool like this, and that would then leave you in the position of just looking at something somebody else has put together and already commented on. So stuff like this would set you up for doing some independent and possibly original research in something like history. So yeah, hopefully it makes sense why you might want to look at something like that. There's this journal called Ecography, which is just an ecology journal. And here, what I've done is I've divided, and this is quite general for most science papers, I've divided it into the abstract, introduction, and discussion, this article I've selected, and then the slightly more technical stuff here, the methods and results. And I sort of just wanted to highlight with this that if you're looking at science journals that are quite, pretty high caliber, very academic, at this stage, there's no reason sort of to have to sort of switch off from this kind of stuff, as long as you're clever about what you actually read and how you engage with it. There are basically 2 pieces of advice here. The first is that if you're looking at anything, but especially science journal articles, don't keep reading it if it's literally completely going over your head, and also don't be disheartened by that. The chances are it's just too technical, and you'd be better off reading something else. That might seem obvious, but loads of people read stuff for their personal statements that they don't fully understand. Whereas if they were engaging with stuff at the level which, where they actually can see what's going on, they have a pretty clear picture, that's how they're actually going to be showing off their independent study skills, progressing academically, for instance. But a lot of these sorts of articles aren't beyond A-level students. It just requires a little bit of sort of foresight and planning in how you engage with it. So you can divide a lot of articles into these more less technical aspects and more technical aspects. You can read things like abstract, introduction, and discussion pretty easily for most things without requiring a significant degree of technical knowledge. And then a lot of the time, especially in life sciences, sometimes in the physical sciences as well, there will be an opportunity to engage in the more technical stuff by taking a few steps back from it. So methods and results in this paper, for example, all of the technical stuff, pretty much, all of the mathematics that might be either beyond A-level or outside of A-level, comes from this particular model that they're using to get their results. And, I mean, I don't do mathematics, so I hadn't seen this model before, for instance. But if you literally Google the model that they're referencing, it has its own website, and you can download the code for the model. You can read a lot of very clear prose written by the people who developed it about what the model does and what mathematics it features. You can go on YouTube and you can learn a bit more about the model as well. And if you're looking at the model yourself and thinking about how it might apply to different ecological situations and stuff, that's a great thing to do. But hopefully it's then clear how you might break something like this down into more manageable chunks. And hopefully then it's clear that supercurricular engagement is definitely more about being focused. You want to read stuff that you understand, but also for stuff that you don't understand, there's no point just trying to skim over it. You want to be engaging with it in a sort of, in a more focused and measured way to demonstrate that you're good at independent learning. So I hope the point of this of showing you this one is clear. And then the last one to show you is just this one from Philosopher's Imprint, which is a really great academic journal. I didn't know it was open access actually, but there's a lot of stuff in here that if you're interested in philosophy will be very useful. But the point of showing you this one is that sometimes even in arts and humanities, you will get a situation like the ecography paper where you might not understand all the mathematics or you might not understand all the technical ideas, but still it makes sense to engage within the content. And for arts and humanities, it's a little bit different from the sciences. You're not necessarily going to be able to divide the paper into these more easy to understand bits and then these more technical aspects. A paper like this, for example, an essentialist theory of the meaning of slurs, uses a lot of technical stuff from the outset, but it's technical in a different way. It requires knowledge of stuff in the philosophy of language, for instance, and it requires a bit of an understanding of why philosophy of language, in a really more technical sense, is useful for feminist philosophy. And it might actually be really obvious intuitively why that's the case. But then to go deep into this paper, you'd need to understand it in a bit more technical detail. So, and I might be wrong because it's my own subject, so it's a bit difficult to know if something is hard at A level in the way that it's easy to tell when you don't do the subject. But with something like this, you wouldn't read it all straight away. You might have a skim of it, you might read the introduction and the conclusion, but then you might use this article as a way of finding further reading. You might think, I'm really, really interested in this connection between, philosophy of language and philosophy of feminism, for instance. And then you might think, well, one thing for me to read about, I need to read some introductory articles to philosophy of language and some introductory articles to philosophy of feminism. You might even look at the bibliography of this, and you might find some academic papers that are actually slightly more accessible. Maybe they're earlier, maybe they're more survey articles, maybe they're historical pieces that that talk about a really important paper, but that was written 100 years ago or so. So hopefully that also is clear how you might use more high caliber academic papers in arts and humanities to go about researching stuff in more detail. And the idea for both of these is that if something does seem a bit too complicated, that doesn't necessarily mean it's beyond you at the level that you're at. It might just require backtracking a bit, reading some further things, and then building back up to reading something like this. So yeah, I hope that's also clear. I think I'm basically out of time. I had a few other slides I think really I will just include in the PowerPoint, and I think they're quite prosy, these here. So I think you can sort of read through them and it will make sense. But it's just a few suggestions about how to go more concretely into narrowing the scope, as it says at the top here, of what you're reading or what you're engaging with. This has, again, a pretty arts and humanities heavy theme, but I hope it's clear that a lot of what I'm saying, even about arts and humanities stuff, when I use those examples, can be applied quite easily to STEM subjects. And this is definitely the case with this sort of stuff. So there are just a few sort of bullet point suggestions of how you might want to engage with, or make a reading list, for instance, narrow the scope to figure out. Sorry, I'm rambling. Any questions?
Great, thank you, Will. Yeah, there have been a couple of questions. I mean, just to say, I mean, it's just there's just so much resources out there, isn't there? And I constantly take notes, thinking, well, I'm going to tell my son about that. Right, so we've got a question from quite a little while ago. So, do universities prefer all-rounded students, like doing something that is not related to your course? So, I think this is kind of referring particularly to sort of playing sports and learning instruments.
Yeah, it depends on the uni. Somewhere like Cambridge and Oxford, we're only really looking at the supercurricular stuff that I've been talking about. That's not to say that we are not interested in general. It's just that the academic selection has to be really fair. And it means that, you know, if somebody has the opportunity to do like Duke of Edinburgh or something, that shouldn't come up as any kind of disadvantage. Advantage over something who hasn't.
So, Will, for some reason, your sound has gone incredibly distorted, and I don't know why that is.
Interesting.
That's better.
Is it better now?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Other universities might want you to talk about that. Places that aren't Cambridge and Oxford sometimes want a little bit of information about extracurricular stuff you do. You know, this kind of well-rounded person stuff, which is why I said only include 80% supercurricular in your personal statement, because some unis do want to hear about it, so it's important you have a bit of dedicated space, but you don't need to talk about it that much. There's no way to prove that you have done, competed in swimming nationals or something in the way that you're proving in a personal statement that you've read something by talking about it. So yeah, a few lines about that sort of stuff to satisfy some universities, but primarily concentrate on the supercurricular stuff. And just to point out, that should all be stuff that you can do in your own house. It should just be stuff that you can do effectively online for free, as I've sort of tried to emphasize with some of these, some of the links to the resources that I've given in this PowerPoint. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, this is kind of an impossible question to answer, but I'll ask it anyway. And you can give your opinion. Right? Do you think most of us will have a good chance of getting into Cambridge? I mean, that it is. I mean, I'll just answer it from my point of view. I mean, that's so difficult to say, just because it's so down to the individual, really. And you could be someone with 3 A stars and not get a place. You could be someone with less than that and get a place. Yeah. But yeah, Will, what would you say about that?
Yeah, no, I agree. It's hard to say. The thing the thing that will up your chances is working really hard in A levels and then doing the supercurricular stuff in a very sort of like critical and measured way. Rather than panicking, trying to read everything under the sun a few weeks before your personal statement is due. It's to start doing stuff now, thinking about how to engage with your topic, looking at courses online and stuff. And it might turn out that through researching courses and through looking at the different teaching styles at different universities, that you think, actually, I don't want to go to Cambridge or Oxford. Like, they're not as good for what I want to do as other places. There's no reason why that shouldn't happen, because people do think of Cambridge and Oxford as really prestigious, but it's just incorrect to think of them as the best places. They're good for certain things, certain teaching styles, certain ways of approaching a topic. So I would make sure that you sort of have that in the forefront of your mind, rather than getting into somewhere like Cambridge. It's, I want to go to the best university for what I'm interested in and how I'd like to learn. But if you're engaging with supercurricular stuff from now, if you're working hard at A levels and trying to like hit the predicted grades, there's no reason why you can't. It's, a competitive university, so you might not get in, especially, depending on how many people apply that year, especially. But yeah, there's really no reason why you can't, and it's beyond you. Definitely. Hopefully that answers the question. I don't know what more there is to say on that, really.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think it definitely, you should never assume that, like Will says, that Oxford and Cambridge is the right place. If you really loved media studies and you wanted to go to the best university, well, you're not going to find that at Cambridge or Oxford. So the point of being on this course is that we just want you to be able to make those informed decisions. So, and by doing all this extra stuff, I can tell you the personal statement would be so less stressful to write, because you'll just naturally have so much interest and evidence to sort of say. Okay, so we've got a question from Amy here. So how do you develop an analytical and methodical thought process whilst reading to prepare for university level texts? Gosh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, there are actually good resources online for this on things like YouTube, you know, academics talking about the thought processes of going through things that are probably quite easy to find, I think, for individual subjects. But one of the main things is just what I've been talking about with, you know, selecting things carefully. Not necessarily, you know, you don't have to necessarily be thinking any differently to how you even perhaps would normally think. You're just sort of slowing down a little bit, thinking, you know, what do I actually want to read? What's, you know, interesting me about these topics? What can I actually cover, you know, roughly in a decent amount of time? And then just making sure that you're doing really standard stuff, like, you know, reading the text more than once, making notes on it, focusing on it. So, you know, the other pieces of reading, for instance, are related to the text that you're looking at, things like that. And I mean, one of the best things you can probably do is if you want to get a really sort of ahead analyzing particular text, you know, in you know, primary sources, for instance, or really important academic sources, it's to read commentary on them, if you can find it. So if you're reading, for instance, I mean, I'll use something from my own subject. If you're reading Descartes' Meditations, for instance, that's really easy to read. It's just, you know, it's just him in an armchair thinking about stuff very, very clearly. But it's very easy to sort of be misled by that and think, oh yeah, what he's saying is really obvious, and it's you know, I can just sort of, you know, get what he's saying in one reading. Picking up some commentary on, you know, Descartes, for example, some, you know, a few different pieces of commentary that dissect, for instance, the first meditation. That is a really good approach. You're seeing what other people have thought about a text that initially seems very transparent, and you are reading you know, you're learning about the different ways in which you could interpret a simple text like that, for instance. Hopefully that makes sense. That sort of roughly answers it anyway. But obviously, I think a full answer to something like that would take another talk at least to do. So sorry if that's
there you go. No, Amy said thank you. I mean, just to add though, I think now whilst we're talking about all this supercurricular, it's really worth getting some sort of diary or notebook where you actually make notes on everything that you've read, or everything, you know, if you go to a taster course or masterclass, just make a note of what it was, because you'd be surprised what you forget, actually. I mean, it should stay in your mind, but I would just make every time you read a book, do a little summary of what you've read and your thoughts on it.
And I was just gonna say, and you know, jotting down what you've done and then thoughts is really good, but then also just like occasionally when a thought comes to you, jot it down as well, because like, you know, like you said, it's so easy to forget certain things, and often you can use thoughts that you've had, you know, on the spur of the moment that you don't think are particularly insightful, for instance, as a basis for, you know, writing projects and things like that, that can end up being quite useful. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's Isha has asked a question about the personal statement and work experience, but I mean, we will be going in massive detail about the personal statement. So I think we'll probably cover that in future sessions, but I don't want to. We've kind of gone over time, but I think Will is coming back to do another 2 sessions. It would be useful, I think, if you could, students, just to tell us what you would like covered, basically, because I think we can do a session on the personal statement, certainly. Would it be useful to speak to undergraduates at Cambridge and find out their experience? Would it, you know, just perhaps jot down a few things? Oh yeah, that's a good, because obviously usually this time of year we take students to Cambridge for a visit and we have a lovely day at Corpus Christi. Obviously we can't do that, but maybe we could have some kind of virtual visit or something. I don't know, you could show us around somehow.
Well, we have I don't know if we did this actually last year. I know I ran it for the open days and some other sessions, but we have this virtual tour software, which I mean, to be fair, you know, if you're really enthusiastic, you can look at it on your own, but it's also quite useful I've found just to sort of show students around, talk about various aspects of corpus. You can see the rooms, for instance, and it's all 360. So stuff like that, Q&As with students is all very, very doable and probably quite useful.
Okay, and we've got there's a lot about kind of personal statements. What's an ideal example, the interview experience, and I think lots of people saying yes sounds interesting. I think the opportunity perhaps to talk to undergrads and maybe have some kind of virtual tour just so that you can sort of see. I think looking at a typical room would be quite interesting. But okay, if any more, what I'm going to do after this session is, or probably tomorrow, is send out a very quick survey to kind of get a bit more of an idea about what your academic interests are, to see if we can try and set up these subject discussion groups. But also I think it would be useful to, on that form, I'm going to ask you what goals you're setting yourself, but in manageable chunks, like Will says. So it might just be, I'm going to look up this journal, I'm going to read this or do that or find a masterclass. So I'll send that out, and it'd just be nice to kind of get that back from everyone here, it will really help us plan, make sure the sessions are really useful to you. But you're going to see Will at least twice more. Is that the right word?
I think so, yeah. I can be quite flexible in terms of what we cover in those sessions, just based on what you end up getting from the survey and stuff. I'm happy to do personal statements. Maybe I think it would end up being a bit more interactive, because we've covered a lot of the stuff that a lot of it is as simple as just doing the supercurricular stuff. So maybe a bit more interactive, looking at how to write the statements and stuff. But but I'm happy to do Q&As and virtual tours and things as well.
That'd be great. Okay, all right. So thanks so much, Will. Again, and so the next, I will send an update of all the next meetings, which are going to be on Microsoft Teams, not Google now. And I'll send that form out. And any more questions that you think of that you wish you'd had asked Will, and obviously you can just email them through to me, and I can pass them on, and I will circulate Will's PowerPoint as well, so you can have a look at that in your own time. So.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, use the links in that, because I've hyperlinked all the stuff.
Brilliant.
So all of the journals and things like that, you can just click on the links and it will take you straight to the place. Yeah.
Fantastic. All right. Well, that takes us to 8 minutes past 5. So we've, but yeah, great. Okay. So thanks everyone. Have a nice evening.
Thanks. Bye.